He tried to laugh when the front door latched behind him like it had a mind of its own, because laughing felt safer than admitting the little sound had put his shoulders up around his ears. It was 2014 in Sandpoint, Idaho, and the house was supposed to be the clean restart I kept promising myself after a year that had taken more out of me than I wanted to say out loud. By midnight, that same house had taken my phone, my keys, and every easy way out, and it did it without a bang or a crash. It did it the way real trouble usually shows up, quiet and practical, like somebody knew exactly what to touch. It started with things I could explain if I didn't look at them too closely. A light going out in a room I hadn't used, then coming back like nothing happened. A basement door that wouldn't stay shut even after I leaned my weight into it and heard the latch click. A smell that moved around the house, old paint one minute, damp cardboard the next, like the walls were exhaling. Then the missing person flyer I found folded inside the kitchen junk drawer, already creased like someone had handled it a lot. That one was the first thing that made me stop and stare, because it didn't belong in a drawer that had been cleaned out by a bank crew, and it didn't look like it had been sitting there untouched for years. When I finally went downstairs to check the breaker panel, the power came back on by itself. That should have been a relief. It wasn't, because in the headlamp beam, I saw my toolbox moved, opened, and arranged with the kind of care you don't do by accident. Somebody had cracked a paint can I hadn't touched, then wiped the rim clean like they cared about drips. And when I called out, a voice answered from somewhere inside the house that wasn't a room, calm and controlled, like it had been waiting for me to ask the right question. He said one sentence that made my stomach turn cold. He said it like a fact. "Don't touch that." I backed up, trying to find the stairs by touch, and my heel hit something soft. It was a shoe, not mine, still warm. Let me tell you exactly how it went. At the time I was 29, and I'd just bought my first house, which is something I used to think would make me feel like a real adult. Instead, I felt like a man who had finally signed his name onto one more responsibility he couldn't afford to mess up. I was broke in that specific way where you can pay for the big thing, the mortgage, but you're counting the little things in your head, like gas, groceries, and whether the heater will make it through winter without a surprise. I'd been renting places where the walls were thin and the neighbors were close enough to hear your TV, and I kept telling myself that owning something would feel quieter, like it would put a little space between me and everything that had been going wrong. The listing came from a local agent named Marcy Vale. She had that polished, cheerful voice people use when they want to make problems sound temporary, and she showed up on a gray Wednesday afternoon with a ring of keys that didn't match each other. She smiled like she was already imagining the before and after photos. "It needs work," she said, holding the keys out in her palm. "But it's solid, and it's priced to move." Price to move, bank-owned, no disclosures. Those are three phrases that should make you slow down. But when you're tired and you've spent months watching every decent place get bought by someone with cash, you start treating red flags like scenery. The house sat at the end of a short street with fir trees, old pickups and driveways, and that Sandpoint mix of lake air and wood smoke that makes even a tired neighborhood look peaceful. The yard had a leaning fence and a shed with peeling paint, the kind of shed you tell yourself you'll fix once you get settled, which is a lie most people live with for years. Inside, the place smelled like fresh paint layered over cold dust. The floors had that soft bounce of older framing, not dangerous, just alive. The doors had been repainted, but not carefully. I could see brush lines on the hinges and little dried drips near the bottom edges, like someone had done the minimum to make it look presentable from 5 feet away. Marcy stayed close and kept talking, pointing out the newish appliances and the good bones, making little jokes about how every house has quirks. "Bank-owned," she said again as we moved through the living room into the kitchen. "No disclosures. They won't tell us anything. But look at the space. You could make this really nice." That meant nobody had to tell me what happened there, and nobody was obligated to answer questions I didn't know to ask. We walked upstairs, 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing even screamed run. It was just a cheap house that needed attention, like half the houses young guys end up in when they're trying to climb out of a hole. The basement stairs were behind a door off the kitchen. The knob was old, painted over at least twice. Marcy put her hand on it and paused for the first time that day, like her body remembered something her mouth didn't want to mention. "Basement's fine," she said. "Just storage. You'll want to change the locks, obviously." I opened it anyway, because curiosity gets dressed up as responsibility when you're buying something. The air coming up felt damp, not water damp, more like a closed space that had been shut for too long. I took 2 steps down, used my phone light, and saw a low ceiling with ductwork, exposed studs, and a concrete floor. The breaker panel sat on the far wall, and I noticed, without really processing it, that the insulation on one section of duct looked newer than the rest, bright and clean like it had been replaced. I didn't go farther that day. I told myself I'd come back once the place was mine, when it would be my problem and not a tour. Marcy shut the basement door behind me with a firm, practiced motion and started talking about closing dates, and I followed her upstairs like the basement had already been filed away in my head as later. 2 weeks later, it was mine. The first day I moved in, I carried boxes in by myself because I didn't have a big group of friends to call, and I didn't want to explain again how tight things were. I didn't own much: a bed, some clothes, a cheap couch, a folding table, and the tools I'd collected from odd jobs and side work, because tools feel like security when you don't have savings. I set the bed frame in the upstairs bedroom and left the mattress on the floor like a college kid, telling myself it was temporary. I changed the locks that afternoon. Every exterior door got a new deadbolt, and I replaced the screws in the strike plates with longer ones because a friend of mine used to do property maintenance, and he'd drilled that into me years earlier. "Long screws buy you time," he'd said. "Time buys you options." I checked windows, tested latches, made a little mental map of the house the way you do when you're alone, and you want to feel like you're in control of a new space. That night, I ate takeout leaning on the kitchen counter and listened to the heater push warm air through the vents. It felt normal, boring in the best way. Outside, the street was quiet, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the occasional car passing like a reminder that other people were living their ordinary lives. I remember thinking I might actually sleep well for the first time in weeks. Then I noticed the junk drawer. It stuck halfway open, like something blocked it. I pulled it the rest of the way and felt it scrape against the wood, and behind the usual junk drawer stuff, a couple of mismatched screws, a bent spoon, a takeout menu from a place that didn't exist anymore, I found a folded piece of paper jammed behind the back panel. It wasn't a receipt. It wasn't a manual. It was an old missing person flyer, black and white photo, a young woman in her early 20s, smiling into a camera. The date at the top was a few years earlier. The last known location was in Bonner County. I stood there holding it, feeling like I'd accidentally put my hand into someone else's grief. I don't like touching other people's life like it's mine, so I set it on the counter and told myself I'd throw it out later. I told myself it was probably left behind by the previous owner, maybe a neighbor, maybe it got shoved in there during some frantic search period and forgotten. It didn't have to mean anything. I didn't throw it out. The next thing was my phone. I know where I put it. On the kitchen counter, screen down, next to the keys. I went to get a glass of water, turned around, and it was gone. That sounds small, but it hits you in a specific way when you're alone in a house you've owned for less than 12 hours. I checked my pockets. I checked the couch. I checked the bathroom sink like an idiot. I opened the fridge like my phone could have walked in there by itself. I even looked under the takeout bags because my brain was trying to force the world back into normal mistakes. It wasn't anywhere. I stood still for a long moment and listened. The heater ran. The fridge hummed. The house didn't do anything dramatic. It just sat there while I tried to decide whether I was already losing it. People misplace things. New house, new routines, boxes everywhere. That's what I told myself as I walked room to room, my irritation growing, because the easiest explanation was that I was tired and careless. I found the phone an hour later on the floor by the basement door. The screen was dark. When I picked it up, the battery was at 1%. That should have made me feel better. Batteries drain, phones get set down and forgotten. But I hadn't been near that door. The phone hadn't been there when I walked past earlier. I would have seen it because the hallway light had been on. I stared at the basement door and felt a prickling along the back of my neck that I tried to ignore. Then I latched the basement door from the inside with the little latch at the top and went upstairs. telling myself I was overreacting. I told myself the phone probably slid off the counter and I just didn't hear it. I told myself it was one of those first night in a new place things. At 11:40 p.m., the upstairs bedroom light went out while I was brushing my teeth. Not the whole house, just the bedroom. The bathroom light stayed on, the hallway light stayed on, and the kitchen light downstairs still glowed through the stairwell like a normal house doing normal house things. I walked into the bedroom, flipped the switch twice, then pulled the chain on the ceiling fan. Nothing. The bulb was new. I'd checked it earlier. It wasn't that. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight, and the battery warning flashed like a joke. 1%. I'd had it charging earlier. I could picture the charger plugged in by the couch. I could picture myself setting the phone down. But I couldn't picture actually watching it charge, and that made me uneasy in a way that didn't feel logical. I went downstairs to check the charger, using the hallway light to see. The charger was plugged in. The phone cable was there. The phone wasn't. When I reached the top of the stairs and looked down toward the kitchen, I saw the basement door open about 2 inches. I had latched it. I went down slowly because that's what your body does when your mind is still arguing with itself. I didn't want to rush and find out it was nothing, because then I'd be embarrassed at myself, even though nobody was watching. I put my hand on the knob. The wood felt colder than it should have, the way metal feels cold even when the room is warm. I shut the door and listened for the latch. It clicked, but it didn't feel like it seated right, like the frame was slightly out of square. I told myself the latch was cheap. I told myself old houses settle. I told myself the previous owner probably slammed that door 1,000 times and warped it. I tried to keep it in the world of boring explanations. Then the power went out. This time, it went out everywhere, like the house had shut its eyes. The heater cut off. The fridge went quiet. The lights died all at once, and the silence was immediate and heavy. Outside, there was no helpful glow through the windows, no streetlight spill. The neighborhood was there, but the house felt sealed off from it, like a closed fist. I stood in the kitchen in full dark and realized I could hear my own breathing too clearly. I reached for my phone out of instinct, and when I tapped the screen, it didn't wake. Battery gone. No light, no signal, nothing. I didn't panic yet. I'm not wired that way. I just got very still and tried to think like a person solving a simple problem. Breaker, basement, flashlight somewhere. House systems fail. That's what houses do. I opened a moving box on the counter by feel and found my headlamp in the top layer because at some point I'd bought it for a camping trip I never took. I snapped it on and the beam cut a hard tunnel through the kitchen. The first thing it landed on was the junk drawer, still open a crack like it had been disturbed again. The missing person flyer was gone. That hit me harder than the blackout because it made the situation feel personal, like something in the house was paying attention to what I noticed. I pulled the drawer open and pawed through it with my fingers, trying not to let my mind run. The flyer wasn't there. The drawer was a mess, but it was a different mess than before, like someone had moved things with intention and then tossed a few pieces back to make it look careless. Then I heard something upstairs. Not a dramatic sound, not a crash, just a shift, like weight moving on old flooring. I froze and aimed the headlamp toward the stairs. The light didn't reach the top. It just lit the first few steps and the wall, and beyond that was a dark that felt thicker than it should have. I called out, "Hello?" because you don't want to believe there's a person in your house until you force the world to answer you. No answer came back, but I heard another quiet sound, the soft scrape of something, like fabric on wood. I moved to the front door with the headlamp beam bouncing in front of me. I turned the deadbolt and pulled, expecting the door to open into the cool night air. Instead, it moved maybe a 1/4 inch and stopped hard, like it had hit something solid. Not the latch, something else. It didn't feel like a swollen door in a warped frame. It felt like the door was physically being held shut. I tried again, pushing this time. Same result. A tiny give, then a stop. My headlamp beam flashed across the threshold, and I saw right at the base a dark shape pressed against the crack from the inside, like a wedge. I crouched and touched it. Rubber. A doorstop jammed tight under the door. My mouth went dry. I walked quickly to the back door because maybe the front was stuck and I was letting my imagination do the rest. The back door bolt turned. The handle moved. The door gave a little, then held. I aimed the beam down and saw it there too, another wedge pressed in tight, the kind you buy for a couple dollars and forget about. Somebody had wedged me inside my own house, and they'd done it in a way that didn't require strength, just planning. That's when my brain stopped offering normal explanations. I grabbed a kitchen knife because it was there, because my hands needed something, and because being empty-handed in the dark felt like agreeing to lose. It was a stupid weapon, but it was better than nothing. Then I went back to the basement door. It stood open again, wider this time, like someone was inviting me down. I didn't rush. I didn't play tough. I stepped down one stair at a time, keeping the headlamp beam steady and keeping my body slightly turned so I could retreat. The basement air was cooler, smelling like wet cardboard and old paint. Halfway down, I saw my toolbox on the concrete floor, open. Tools spread out neatly, lined up like someone had organized them. My screwdrivers in a row, a pry bar laid parallel to them, a roll of tape sitting upright like a display. I hadn't opened that toolbox since the move. I hadn't even carried it down there. I reached the bottom and swung the beam to the breaker panel. The main switch sat up, not tripped. Everything looked normal in that one small circle of light, which somehow made it worse, because it meant the blackout wasn't a simple system failure. The power being out didn't match the breaker being fine, at least not in a way I could fix with a flip of a switch. I took 2 steps toward it anyway, because your body keeps moving when your mind is stuck, and I wanted to prove this was just a problem with an answer. That's when a voice said, calm and close, "Don't touch that." It didn't come from behind me. It didn't come from the stairs. It came from the wall, from inside the duct space, like someone was speaking through a gap I couldn't see. The sound was clear enough to understand, but wrong enough to make my skin tighten, because no part of me wanted to accept there was a person where there shouldn't be a person. My hand clenched around the knife handle. I didn't raise it. I just froze, trying to listen without making noise. "Who are you?" I said, and my voice sounded thin in the basement. "Go back upstairs," the voice said. "Turn around. Slow." I took 1 step back, and the headlamp beam shook and landed near the bottom stair. That's where I saw the shoe. A woman's sneaker, scuffed and dirty, sitting on its side like it had been kicked off in a hurry. It looked out of place the way a child's toy looks out of place on a highway, because it suggests movement and fear without showing either. It wasn't cold. The rubber didn't have that dead, stored in a garage look. It looked like it had been worn recently, like it had been in warm air. I backed up again, staring at the shoe, and my heel hit something soft. I looked down and saw a knit glove, gray, the kind people wear in spring when the mornings are still cold. A single glove, not a pair. The voice said, "You shouldn't have bought this house." My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, but what came out was, "I'm leaving." "Doors won't open," the voice said, and there was a small pause like he was checking whether I'd learned my lesson. "You already learned that." I kept backing up until my calf hit the first stair. I didn't turn my back. I didn't run. I moved the way you move when you don't want to invite someone to rush you. I made it up 3 steps, then 4, and then something moved in the dark to my left. Not fast, not a lunge, just a shift behind the duct line, like a body repositioning inside the walls. I heard a scrape of something hard on concrete, slow and deliberate. I pivoted and ran the rest of the way up, heart pounding hard enough to make my headlamp bounce. At the top, I slammed the basement door shut and threw the latch, and for a moment, I stood there with my hand on it, listening. The latch held for about 2 seconds. Then the door pushed inward like someone leaned against it from below. Not a slam, a steady pressure that made the wood flex and the screws creak. The pressure wasn't frantic. It was confident, like he knew exactly how much force he needed to apply. I backed into the kitchen and looked for my keys out of habit, because my brain still wanted the simple exit. The keys weren't on the counter. I stared at that blank spot, and the anger that rose in my chest surprised me because it was immediate and hot. Somebody had taken my keys, and that meant I couldn't even get to my car if I got outside. I ran to the front door anyway and dropped to the floor, yanking at the rubber wedge with my fingers. It was jammed tight, pushed in so far the door pressed it like a clamp. I dug my nails in, pulled until my fingers hurt, and finally it slid free. I shoved it aside, stood up, turned the deadbolt, and pulled. The door still didn't open. I tried again, harder. The door bowed, then stopped, like something was catching it higher up. I aimed the headlamp beam and saw it. The secondary latch I hadn't noticed before, a swing bar latch mounted high on the frame, painted over so it blended in. It was engaged. Somebody had flipped it while I was downstairs. That's the moment I understood how little time I had, because that latch couldn't be flipped from outside. It had to be done from inside my house. The pressure against the basement door increased. The latch screws creaked again, and the sound was so human, so mechanical, that it made my skin crawl. I ran to the living room window, yanked the curtain aside, and fumbled with the lock. The window opened with a stiff jerk, and cold air hit my face like it had been waiting. I shoved the sash up, leaned out, and for a second I thought I was free, because the night air felt like a door opening in my head. Then a hand grabbed my ankle. It came from behind, from the dark inside the room. Fingers locked around my leg with total certainty. The grip was strong, but what scared me wasn't the strength, it was the control. Whoever had me didn't yank wildly. He pulled like he was reeling something in that he'd already decided was his. I kicked hard. The grip tightened. I grabbed the window frame with both hands and pulled, my palms sliding on the painted wood. The headlamp beam swung wildly, strobing the room, and in that swinging light, I caught movement near the hallway. Not a blur, an actual person shifting position. I yelled, "Let go!" and my voice cracked, because fear doesn't care what kind of person you think you are. From somewhere below, from the basement, the same calm voice said, "You're going to stay." My headlamp beam swung and caught the man for the first time. Not a full view, just a slice of him in the hallway mirror. Enough to know he was real. He wore dark work clothes. His hair looked short or tucked under a cap. He moved like someone used to crawling in tight spaces, shoulders rolling low, head slightly down like he didn't want to bump into beams. In his other hand, he held my phone, screen dark. Something about seeing my phone in his hand made me snap because it was proof. It wasn't the house. It wasn't a weird night. It was a person doing this on purpose. I drove my heel back into his wrist and felt the grip falter. I kicked again, harder, and his fingers slipped just enough. I threw myself out the window, landing hard in the yard, shoulder first, then rolling onto my back, gasping like I'd been underwater. The headlamp stayed on, the beam jittering across grass in the lower part of the house. I got up and ran barefoot down the street, not thinking about glass, not thinking about cold, only thinking about distance. My feet hit gravel, and I barely felt it. I went to my neighbor's house 3 doors down because I'd seen their porch light on earlier in the evening and because my brain needed a target. I hammered the door with my fist until the porch light snapped on and the door opened part way. An older man stood there in a t-shirt, eyes wide, holding a cordless phone like he'd already been reaching for it. "What's wrong with you?" he said, and his gaze dropped to my bare feet, then my headlamp, then the knife I was still holding like an idiot. "I need you to call 911, I said. "Someone's in my house. He locked me in." The older man didn't argue. He didn't ask me if I was drunk or if I was sure. He stepped back, raised the phone, and dialed. While he spoke fast into the receiver, he motioned me inside, and I stood just over the threshold because I didn't want to bring my panic into his living room like a contagious thing. From his doorway, I could see my place down the street. In the dark, it looked normal. Just another 2-story house with a porch and a small yard. Then the upstairs bedroom light came on. I hadn't turned it on. A shadow moved behind the curtain, slow and deliberate, like someone wanted me to see it and understand that distance didn't mean safety. I felt my throat tighten, and for the first time that night I thought very clearly that I might not have gotten out if I'd hesitated one more second. The sheriff's deputies arrived in under 10 minutes. It felt longer, but it was quick enough that I knew my neighbor had given a clear address and sounded convincing. 2 vehicles rolled in, lights washing the street in blue and red, and the neighbor's porch lights started turning on up and down the block like a wave. A deputy stepped to the neighbor's porch and looked at me, taking in my headlamp, my bare feet, the shaking I couldn't stop. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes sharpened. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I don't think so," I said. He grabbed me. I got out the window. "Is anyone else in the house?" another deputy asked, already moving, already looking toward my place. "No," I said. "Just him. Describe him." "I didn't get a good look," I said. and the words sounded ridiculous even as I spoke them. He spoke from inside the walls. He had my phone. The deputy didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He just nodded once, like he'd heard stranger things in Bonner County than people want to believe. They approached my house with flashlights and steady voices, calling out, announcing themselves, the way trained people do when they don't want surprises. They didn't use the front door. They went to the window I'd climbed out of, checked the frame, and one of them climbed in carefully with his light sweeping low. Another deputy covered him from outside, and the third stayed back, watching the sides of the house like he expected someone to run. From the neighbor's porch, I watched their lights move room to room. I watched them pause and speak into radios. I watched them test doors and windows. When one of them called out, "We've got a crawl access here," my stomach dropped again because I knew exactly what that meant, even though I didn't want to. They found the basement door open. They found my toolbox laid out like a display. They found the missing person flyer on the basement floor, torn in half, as if someone had decided it was no longer useful. One deputy came back out and asked me where the breaker panel was. Another asked me whether the house had any attic access. Their questions were practical, grounded, and the practicality made the situation feel even more real. They didn't find him at first. A few minutes later, a deputy's voice carried out from inside, sharper now. "Here, over here." The sheriff arrived not long after, an older man with a tired face and the posture of someone who'd spent years trying to keep small problems from turning into big ones. He walked up to the neighbor's porch, looked at me, then looked back at my house like he was measuring it. "Who sold you the house?" he asked. "A realtor," I said. "Marcy Vale." The sheriff's expression tightened. "Do you know where she is tonight?" "No," I said. "I saw her at closing. That's it." He turned and spoke quietly to a deputy. A few minutes later, another deputy came back out of my house and said they'd found a handbag in a concealed space, along with some personal items. They said the name on a card inside was Marcy Vale. The words didn't land at first. They floated, then they settled, heavy. Her car still sat at the curb in front of my house, keys in the ignition, driver door shut like she planned to step out for a second and go right back. I hadn't noticed it earlier because my brain had been on my own crisis, and that made me feel sick, like my survival had been happening on top of something worse. By sunrise, state investigators showed up, along with a technician who took photos and logged evidence while deputies stood by in that quiet, watchful way. They pulled the house apart like it was a machine, and they did it without drama, because to them it wasn't haunted and it wasn't a story. It was a crime scene, and crime scenes have patterns. They found signs of a concealed route through structural voids, spaces that shouldn't have been accessible in the way they were. They pointed out disturbed insulation, scuffed wood, and small marks where panels had been removed and replaced. They didn't explain it like a how-to. They just showed me enough to make my skin crawl, because the conclusion was simple. Someone had been living inside that house without being seen, and he knew it better than I did. They found a small hidden area set up with supplies. They found canned food stacked neatly. They found spare batteries, a couple of cheap flashlights, and a small notebook. They found a set of keys that didn't belong to me. They found my keys. My name was in that notebook. It wasn't written like a diary. It was written like a list. Dates, addresses, names, license plates, little notes that meant something to the person who wrote them. My name was there with my car and the day I'd closed on the house. Seeing it made my stomach drop harder than the blackout had, because it meant I hadn't wandered into a random problem. Someone had picked me, and the only reason I was alive to read it was because I'd moved fast at the one moment that mattered. They asked me to sit down in my neighbor's kitchen and give a statement while they worked, and as I talked, I kept hearing that calm voice in my head, the way it said, "Don't touch that," like he'd been practicing that tone for years. The investigators asked about Marcy, about my interactions with her, about whether she'd seemed nervous or distracted at closing. I replayed every conversation in my mind and realized how easy it is to miss fear when someone is good at hiding it. They arrested him that afternoon, not in my house, but under the bridge near the lake, sitting on a sleeping bag with a duffel beside him. That detail came to me later from the sheriff, because at that point I couldn't stand to be near my own place. A deputy recognized him from old calls and from a trespass warning at a vacant property. His name was Trevor Pask. He'd done maintenance work for a property company in town, which meant he'd had legitimate reasons to be in empty houses, legitimate reasons to know floor plans, crawl spaces, and the kind of shortcuts builders take when nobody is looking. The sheriff told me, simple and flat. He'd been using that house for years. They linked him to missing person cases in the county, and they said the notebook gave them enough to reopen more. They wouldn't tell me everything, and I didn't want everything. I wanted only the parts that helped my brain accept that this had been a human problem with human logic, not something supernatural hiding in my walls. The investigators eventually told me Marcy hadn't left on her own. They found her a few days later. They didn't describe it to me in detail, and I'm grateful for that, because some images don't help anything. The town found out anyway, because news travels fast in places like Sandpoint, and people left flowers by her office like it could rewind time. I moved out that same week. I didn't do it in a proud, dramatic way. I did it like someone evacuating a fire before the smoke reaches the roof. I stayed with a friend for 2 nights, then signed paperwork to let the bank take the house back. I lost money, I lost sleep, I lost the simple excitement I'd felt about owning something. I started noticing corners differently. I started listening to houses the way you listen to a stranger's tone. I started checking locks twice and feeling stupid for doing it, and then feeling worse for the fact that I'd ever felt stupid. Before I left for good, an investigator handed me a plastic bag with items they'd cleared as mine. My phone, my keys, a tape measure, a wallet I hadn't noticed missing. They were ordinary things, and seeing them in a bag like evidence made them feel chudged, like they belonged to some other version of my life. Then he held up one more item, a photo. It showed me standing in Marcy's office on closing day, leaning over the desk, signing papers. My face looked tired. My hair stuck up in the way it does when you've stopped caring about small appearances. The timestamp in the corner read June 18th, 2014. I never saw anyone take that photo. The investigator said, "We found it in his space, along with photos of other buyers. He kept them." He didn't call them trophies, but that's what they were, and the words settled in my stomach like a stone. I stared at the image until my eyes felt hot, because it wasn't just proof that someone had been near me. It was proof that someone had been watching me in places I assumed were safe, in daylight, around other people, and I hadn't felt a thing. I asked one question, and I'm still not sure why I needed the answer. "How did he get that?" I said. The investigator didn't speculate. He didn't build a story. He just said, he had access to spaces. Sometimes he was closer than people realize. That was enough. Months later, I got one more call from the sheriff. He told me they'd finished going through Trevor's notebook, and they'd contacted names in other states. They'd found a storage unit in Spokane with tools and spare locks and stacks of blank rental applications, the kind of paperwork that lets a person slide into other people's lives without raising alarms. The sheriff's voice stayed professional, but there was something tired under it, the way a person sounds when they've seen how wide a pattern can spread. He said, "You weren't first on his list? Just the first who got out?" When I hung up, I sat in my new apartment and looked at that closing day photo one last time. The apartment was small, the walls were plain, and there were no hidden doors, at least none that I knew of. I tore the photo in half and threw it away, not because it erased anything, but because I understood something simple and ugly. If a stranger can take a picture of you in a room full of people, you can live your whole life thinking you're alone and still be watched.